Garima Mohan is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We should probably start with the deals that are going to be signed in Paris. I understand that they're going to buy, about 36 Rafale fighters from the French. How important is that to Indian defence?
It is extremely important for Indian defense because India is really pushing to diversify away from Russia. It wants to reduce its dependence on Russia. In fact, it has been doing that for the last decade, which is why France has been an extremely important partner for India over the last 10 years. In fact, France is the second largest military supplier for India after Russia. So this 26 Rafale jet deal, as well as 3 submarines for the Indian Navy, is quite important. We're also anticipating some sort of collaboration between France and India in terms of co-manufacturing and co-designing. So France and India working together in building weapons platforms, which is quite important because India wants to reduce dependence on any one partner.
Mr. Modi's made some pretty bold claims of late that India can act as the counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. Does India have the will and the means to deliver on those promises?
I think India certainly has the will to deliver on those promises. In terms of means, it's working on it. So India is working really hard to build national capacities, capabilities, particularly when it comes to the Indian armed forces. But I think a very pressing concern for India is China at the border. India-China ties have never been in this sort of really bad low condition before. And therefore, India is trying very hard to seek partnerships elsewhere because there's strength in numbers. And it wants to work in different coalitions, for example, with the Quad, with countries like Japan, Australia, the United States, to build capabilities.
But that's the point, isn't it? It wants to work across many different coalitions. Here's what Le Monde wrote on Mr. Modi's arrival in France. India is not anxious, they say, is anxious not to alienate China and does not rule out collaborating with it, as it does with the BRIC countries, explicitly to beat back Western domination. Is that at the heart of it? Mr. Modi doesn't want to get stuck with any one coalition?
I would absolutely disagree with that statement. India is not non-aligned when it comes to China. India has a very clear position when it comes to China. It is not trying to placate it or trying to make nice with China. In fact, India is one of the few countries that has very strong policies on China. In fact, New Delhi thinks that European countries still have not decided which way they want to go. The fact that India works in multilateral forums like BRICS, etc., I think we have to look at the deliberations of these institutions where India often takes pro-Western positions. Let me note that India vetoed the idea of a BRICS currency, also has problems with the expansion of the BRICS that is being proposed by China. So it is more nuanced than simply saying...
But India has abstained 5 times from condemning the invasion of Ukraine at the UN. And his host this week, President Macron, has been very critical of countries sitting on the fence, accusing them of complicity in Russia's new imperialism. Do you think he's going to work on Prime Minister Modi while he's there in Paris?
I think France, as well as other European countries, have certainly been bringing up Ukraine with New Delhi, and I think this issue will be mentioned again. I do believe that India has been quite open in discussing its position with European politicians as well as policymakers. So there is some form of understanding of India's position, but there's definitely a push to make sure that it aligns more with the West.
I mean, the Indians in some ways are benefiting from this war because they've increased the imports of cheap Russian oil, which of course are price capped under those global sanctions. But on the flip side of that, the war makes Russia dependent on China, perhaps to India's disadvantage.
Absolutely, it certainly does. And the growing Russia-China alignment has New Delhi very alarmed because in the border standoff that India currently is engaged in with China, and given how much it is dependent for its security and weapons on Russia, even if Russia was to play a neutral role or wanted to play spoiler in the conflict, it would tilt the scales in China's favor. So for Indian policymakers, this is an absolute long-term concern, which is why we are also seeing fraying in India-Russia ties already. We saw it in the SCO summit. We are seeing it in G20, where India has the presidency. India has been actually calling out Russia and China as the two countries who are opposing the language on Ukraine in the G20 resolutions. So I think the India-Russia story is not over, and we need to keep watching because there are certainly tensions in this relationship, and they're only increasing.
Really interesting. Garima Mohan, thank you very much for taking us around all of that. We will, of course, bring you some pictures of Bastille Day